All right, so Jim Clyburn, one of the most corrupt motherfuckers in Congress, who happened to be the guy who basically stepped in and saved the day for Joe Biden in the 2020 Democratic primary, came out and he basically, in an interview with CNN, gave his take on the current standing of the $3.5 trillion infrastructure negotiations. And what he sees is that the $3.5 trillion number is actually the ceiling and not the floor, which is the complete opposite of what we have been hearing from Bernie Sanders and the rest of the squad. So let's go ahead and watch this clip and hear what he had to say about this.
Ceiling of 3.5 trillion is just that, a ceiling. No one has ever said that that's an exact number or that's a floor. It's up to 3.5 trillion. Now I see that Joe Manchin has mentioned a $1.5 trillion number. Well, somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5, there is $2 trillion. Those $2 trillion are there. And I think that there is a lot of room for people to sit down and negotiate. It may be, when you're sitting around the table, you may not need 3.5 trillion to do what the president wants done and what the country needs done. But let's work on it and stay out of all of this negotiating in the media. That's not the way to negotiate. Let's keep this around the table and see what we can come up with.
Okay, first of all, we're not going to negotiate in the media. That's literally what you're doing right now. You're negotiating in the media by saying that $3.5 trillion is the ceiling. You're actually, more than anybody else from the left wing of this entire debate that's been going on, you are actually going out and arguing it in the media. All that they have been saying is that the negotiations already took place, right? If you remember, at the beginning of this entire process, Bernie Sanders put forward a $6 trillion bill, which the majority of the members of the budget committee got behind, and then he negotiated within the party down to $3.5 trillion. And $3.5 trillion, while it's not nearly enough to actually tackle all of the problems that we need to be tackled in this country, it's a substantial bill, and it's one that even Joe Biden backs, okay? Nancy Pelosi backs it, Chuck Schumer backs it, the entirety of the Democratic establishment backs it, except for apparently Jim Clyburn, Joe Manchin, and a handful of other extremely corrupt Democrats who have massive conflicting interests. One of the interests that James Clyburn happens to have as a conflicting interest with this $3.5 trillion bill is James Clyburn is the single, if not one of the top like 3 or 5 recipients of big pharma donations. And so part of this $3.5 trillion bill is they start the process of allowing the government to negotiate drug prices, right? So we wouldn't have a lot of big pharma companies price gouging in the same way that they are right now. And Jim Clyburn, who takes donations, essentially bribes, from those big pharma companies in a larger amount than anybody else, obviously would have a problem with that and would be willing to negotiate down some of those aspects of the bill. But then that gets to the other point of, what specifically are you talking about here, James Clyburn? I mean, he doesn't get into any of the specifics, right? He just arbitrarily is like, well, you know, I don't know, 3.5 trillion came from this side and Joe Manchin says 1 trillion, so I don't know, there's 2 trillion there to be negotiated. On what? What specifically do you want to be cut out of this bill? And listen, guys, I'm the biggest critic of Nancy Pelosi in the entire world, but she's actually correct in this take that she had here. So Pelosi said, we will pay for more than half, maybe all of the legislation, which is a false dichotomy here. You don't actually need to pay for the legislation. These investments will pay for themselves over the long run. But she continues saying, referring to the tax hikes on the wealthy individuals and large corporations that Democrats are planning to enact in order to offset new spending on healthcare, paid leave, green energy, immigration reform, and other priorities. And she said, to those advocating for a lower price tag, she asked, where would you cut? Childcare, family, medical leave, paid for, universal pre-K, home healthcare. What exactly do you want to cut, Jim Clyburn? I mean, he doesn't actually provide any specifics. He's just arbitrarily like, well, I don't know, 3.5 trillion sounds like a big number, so let's just whittle it down for no goddamn reason, instead of just doing all of these things that are extremely popular and that the American people want you to do. He doesn't provide any argument or any justification for why you would actually go about this process of whittling it down. And again, he started this off by saying, well, nobody is saying that 3.5 trillion is the floor. Well, yes, they have been consistently. Bernie Sanders said this, right? If you remember, Bernie Sanders says 3.5 trillion spending plan is the minimum. This is from August 22nd. Okay, so like 2 weeks ago, Bernie was coming out and saying exactly what James Clyburn is coming out and saying. Nobody has ever said this before. In addition to that, Rashida Talib joining in here. $3.5 trillion is the floor. Ilhan Omar also came out, said the same exact goddamn thing. A lot of other members of the squad have said the same goddamn thing. So he's just making this up when he's talking about this is how the negotiation process was always going to happen. No, it's not. You had your stupid, corrupt, incredibly like oil-funded, fossil fuel-funded privatization scheme within the bipartisan version of this dual-track process that we have going on. You already did your corrupt little handout to fossil fuel executives. Now we're doing the bigger and more substantive $3.5 trillion plan. That's the plan. It's $3.5 trillion for the partisan version and about $1 trillion or $500 billion in new spending for the bipartisan version that you guys insisted on having. And then he turns around here and he's like, no, we need to water this other one down as well. Why? For absolutely no goddamn actual reason. But Rashida Talib actually weighed in here even more to the Washington Post, saying earlier this week, Jayapal, the chair of the nearly 100-member Congressional Progressive Caucus, told the Washington Post that in her view, there is no flexibility on the price tag. Quote, and it's not because I care about what the top line is, it's because I care about delivering on these benefits. She said, if we don't deliver, then I think all of the people who came out and voted for Democrats to take control of the House, Senate, and the White House are going to come out and say, that's it. So she's 100% correct here, right? What the fuck is the point of voting for Democrats where you control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and you're like worrying about negotiating within your own party? Why the fuck can you not get your own party in line? You have a handful of these corrupt senators and members of the House that have entirely corrupted influences. Nobody seems to be talking about that in this entire negotiation process. And these people are coming out on CNN and MSNBC and giving all of these interviews trying to bash the $3.5 trillion one. Well, for what? I mean, these people all are taking massive campaign contributions from the same companies who are coming out through the through a lot of these other institutions and creating a massive lobbying blitz against the $3.5 trillion number. So the corruption is like right out there in the open for everybody to see. And this is the message that you're sending to the American people, that even if you vote for us and we control all three chambers, right? We control the House, we control the Senate, we control the presidency. None of that even matters if you elect us, because we're still going to negotiate within ourselves as if we were negotiating with the Republican Party. Why? Because a lot of these corrupt Democrats are basically Republicans. Jim Clyburn could basically be called a Republican. Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, a lot of these motherfuckers are basically Republicans, right? And so even this half-assed moderate proposal that is, again, the Joe Biden agenda is not being backed by these people. And I thought this was a good tweet as well, because it kind of gives us a indication of where we're actually at right now. So seem to remember that Clyburn endorsed a certain candidate because they wouldn't impede Biden's agenda. Wild, but that's exactly what he's doing right now. So what is he referring to here? So Sam is actually referring to Nina Turner's race, in which Jim Clyburn inserted himself and endorsed Nina Turner's opponent. And one of the justifications he gave for endorsing Nina's opponent is he said, oh, well, Nina Turner is going to be too divisive, right? Chantel Brown, Nina's opponent, is going to be the one who's not going to stand in the way of the Biden agenda. Well, you're literally standing in the way of Biden's agenda. The Biden agenda is the bipartisan version of that $1 trillion bill that you signed, and then on top of that, the $3.5 trillion, which is his American Families Plan, that is the Biden agenda. So how are you going to, on the one sense, go and criticize Nina Turner, call her divisive, and endorse her opponent saying, oh, she won't stand in the way of Biden's agenda, and then you're turning around and standing directly in the way of Biden's agenda? So listen. All of these motherfuckers within the Democratic primary or within the Democratic Party that are coming out and opposing this, the transparent corruption is right out there for everybody to see, okay? Jim Clyburn, of course he wants to water down some of the aspects of this bill because part of that is addressing or countering a lot of what his donors want him to do, right? So it's not complicated. All you have to go and do is look at who's funding these people's campaigns and then look at what their rhetoric is like. Every single piece of this agenda, this $3.5 trillion bill, is overwhelmingly supported by the American people, whether it's the child tax credit or paid family leave, or addressing big pharma's price gouging of the American people. All of these different things are extremely popular. The American people want you to do them. So why would you water it down? Why would you tell the American people that even if you show up to these elections, you vote us into power, we control the entire block of our government, then even then we are going to be watering down and making these proposals pathetic to the point where they're not even worth passing? So listen, the dynamic remains the same in this entire process of this infrastructure negotiation. The Squad, Bernie Sanders, Rashida Talib, the entire left that is within our government needs to stand firm on this and say, we're not going a single dollar below $3.5 trillion. Why would we negotiate with these motherfuckers who don't represent the American people and are in fact blocking the will of the American people with these policies they're opposing? You should just be coming out there and calling out the corruption, right? We know that Joe Manchin earns about $500,000 a year from his coal company. We know that Joe Manchin has weekly calls with ExxonMobil. We know that Jim Clyburn is one of the biggest recipients of big pharma donations. Of course, that's why they're opposing it. So don't budge a single goddamn inch. The American people are behind you on this. You just simply have to get these motherfuckers to fold in line.